Until I saw his name in the newspaper that day. I hadn't thought about David Rowley in over 20 years. Actually, I guess I'd been trying not to think of him. Time moves on, people grow up, and even best friends can grow apart. But when there's an incentive to forget, when some part of people's shared past is so inexplicable, so terrible, it never goes away. You can push it deeper, like a splinter, but it's always going to be there. I'd been on my way out to work that morning when I read his name. I'd picked the newspaper up, ready to throw it away. It was a free local paper, and I rarely had time to do more than glance at it. But his name jumped out at me and hit me like a truck. I sat back down, and by the time I'd read the brief article, the memories were already forcing themselves into my mind. I felt ill. I felt cold and clammy. I felt sick to my stomach. I could have called in sick, but I didn't. I stood over the sink into the kitchen until I was certain I wasn't going to throw up. Then I drank a glass of water, picked up my car keys and left the house. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to have any more time to think. Impossible, of course. The past is always there, right behind us, just where it can be the most dangerous. Rowley had been my closest friend for a number of years in high school. He hadn't any others, through no fault of his own. His father was an abusive drunk, a thoroughly unpleasant man who I'd never heard a good word said about. His mother had left them both some years previously, obviously deciding that the son wasn't worth a father. I think Dave had heard from her occasionally, but we were teenagers. We didn't talk about things like that. We didn't discuss any of the emotional stuff, and I think men never really do. We tried to keep it light, veering away from anything meaningful with a laugh and a flippant comment. It all falls into the spaces between the words, and those spaces end up as some very deep pits. But Dave himself was okay. He could be withdrawn at times, but once you knew his situation, that was understandable. He had a quick temper and a brooding manner. Sometimes his attention wandered and his schoolwork suffered. His father didn't pay out for much, and so he never had new clothes, trainers, school bag. Everything he owned was old, didn't quite fit, frayed and faded. And these things matter when you're that age. You get judged on them. He never got to go on any school trips. He could never invite people round to his house. And so the distance between him and the other kids grew wide enough that nobody ever bothered to cross it. Fate threw us together early on when a teacher put us both together in class. I gave him a chance and stuck with him. I saw a side of him that nobody back then ever saw. He lived in a large, ugly council house across town from me. It was a half-hour walk to get there, but I never minded. We didn't usually stay in his house. Even if his father was out or sleeping off his latest almighty hangover, the place had a miserable atmosphere. Clothes were strewn about along with unwashed plates and mugs. Rubbish overflowed from the bin in the kitchen, which always smelt of grease. The wallpaper was faded, in places falling away altogether. None of the mess was Dave's. His own small room was as spotless as any teenage boy's could be expected to be, and he was obviously embarrassed by the state of the house. It seemed to me as though some vital spark had gone out of the place when his mother had left, the elements of family life perhaps. But then again, I'd never known her. Maybe it had always been that shitty. Instead, if the weather allowed it, and even sometimes when it didn't, we went out walking. Being on the edge of town, we had the best of both worlds. We could wander through the streets, though they were mostly run-down estates, and we had to be feeling in the mood for the possibility of a scrap. Mostly, though, we went the other way, into the countryside. The scenery wasn't exactly beautiful, but it was a world away from anything else that Dave knew, and that was enough. I remember the track we used to take through a gate in a high steel fence that seemed to have been wedged open and into place with age, and down a meandering path surrounded by hugely overgrown weeds that led up to the concrete walls of the backyards of neighbouring houses. Before long, the houses dropped away and the land did too. A steep slope that could be treacherous in wet weather. The woods awaited, scrappy as they were, and we followed their call. A day in early October. The afternoon was darkening, but we'd still have enough light for a couple of hours. We kicked our way through the dust and the dirt and the leaves, ruining our already battle-weary school shoes. Something rustled through the undergrowth. Distantly, a car backfired. Soon we could leave the sounds of the streets behind, if only for a little while. "Are you still seeing Helen?" Dave asked me. I don't know if he really cared. His mind seemed somewhere else, but then again it often did. It's just how he was. I accepted it. I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't really spoken to her since Marie's party. "You'll miss all the hot sex." I laughed. "Yeah, right. I wish. I bet Helen could be hot." "You think?" I raised a cynical eyebrow. I kind of liked Helen, had hung around with her for a handful of weeks, but it seemed to be going nowhere. But I was 15. My hormones were tearing me apart, and I took female company where I could get it, desperate for something more. "Sure, the quiet ones are always the filthiest. She'd go off like a firework." I punched him in the shoulder, only light, but enough to raise a cry of protest. "Hey," I laughed, "that's my girl you're talking about." "No, it isn't," he replied, rubbing his shoulder but grinning at last. "Not anymore." I sighed, kicked a rock into the trees as far as it could go. "Yeah, you're probably right. I think I'm back on the market." "The flea market? Fuck off. What about you? Not tired of tossing yourself off all the time? Can't find anyone else to do it for you?" "If you're offering, then I'll have to politely decline." Dave skipped out of reach of another punch. We skirted what we used to call the pond, but which was just a dip in the path where rainwater collected and grew repulsively stagnant. The rusted framework of a child's bicycle poked out of it. "No, I'm serious. I thought you and Louise Carter were going to get together at the end of last term. What happened?" The mood took a dive. Dave's grin faded. He looked away from me, watched his step as we descended deeper into the woods. "What have I got to offer a girl?" he muttered, and I hadn't the words or the maturity to pursue that one any further. All I could offer was my dumb friendship, and hope that it was enough. We worked our way through the woods, gradually getting back to something approaching our more usual mood through a series of grunts and gestures as we progressed. It didn't take long before we reached the small clearing that we generally considered our base. The trees around the edge of the clearing formed a fairly tight canopy overhead, which shut out the light on all but the brightest of days, but kept us fairly dry and warm on the worst of them. There was an old fallen tree that made a great bench once we brushed off the gathered moss and bugs. This particular day, the day when I guess it really all started to go crazy, we found the stick figures. Dave noticed the first one, and then I noticed another, and then it seemed they were everywhere. I don't know how many there were in the clearing and around the edges of it. We found maybe a dozen. I don't remember for certain. And maybe there were dozens more in amongst the trees, unseen. I don't want to think about that. "Hey, look at this," Dave said as he stooped to pick up the first one. Right away, I didn't like it. "What is it?" "I don't know." He shrugged as though the matter was unimportant, but he kept hold of it as he headed across to the fallen tree. "There's more of them," I said, pushing one out of my path with a gentle nudge. I didn't want to kick it. I felt wary of them. I wonder who made them. The figures were all roughly similar. Without studying them closer, it was hard to be sure. The one Dave had hold of was about 6 inches tall and made of twigs twisted around each other and bound into something approximating a human form. As he turned it in his hands while speaking, the gaps between the twigs seemed to make eyes, a mouth, alive, moving. I hated looking at it, but didn't like to take my eyes off it for too long. We straddled the tree trunk like we'd done countless times before, and we talked of school, of lessons we hated, of teachers we hated, of other kids that we hated. We spoke in vague terms of bigger themes in life, of hopes and fears for our futures, of jobs we'd heard paid great money, of places we'd want to live or even just to visit. I know this much, I said. I'm getting out of this town. Yeah, Dave said and tailed off. He looked down at the stick figure and I saw something in his eyes. I don't know. I remember it now as a light, a kind of a light that either went on or off inside of him. And he looked up at me and said, "Do you really mean it? About getting out of here, getting away?" "Of course," I said, and I did mean it. It wasn't something I ever gave much thought to. I just knew that my future was somewhere else. This place is a dump. Nothing ever happens here and nothing ever will. "But do you think it's possible to get away?" "Sure I do, don't you? I thought you wanted the same." I do. I mean, it's just... He sighed, frustrated either at his lack of words or just lack of understanding of what it was that he was feeling. "I just don't know if it will ever be that easy. Not for you, maybe, but for me. I feel like whatever I want to do in life, it'll all come to nothing. I feel like I'm always going to be held back. I fucking hate my life. I'd love to get away from it all, but it's that bastard. I just look at him and I see no hope. I don't want him as my father. I don't want to be near him. I don't want to be anything like him. If I could be rid of him, I would be." He stopped talking and his eyes had a sheen about them that I didn't recognise. "Is it really that bad?" I felt like I had to say something, though my question seemed redundantly dumb. Maybe the question itself didn't matter because Dave barely seemed to register it. He had badness inside and it needed to come out. "You don't understand. You can't imagine what it's like to live with it day after day. I hate it. I dread going home, dread him still being there, and if he isn't, then I dread him coming back. The longer he's not around, the more of a state I get myself into. I can't stay away from home because he just gets pissed off if I'm not there to shout at. And anyway, where can I go? I know what everyone at school says about me, how they talk and laugh behind my back. Fuck them. Every night I ask God why he has to put me through this, why I can't just live a normal life, have a chance to be normal, you know? And every day it just starts all over again. I honestly don't know how much more I can take." I reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. Other than roughhousing, we never touched each other. It felt weird. I don't know if he even noticed it. I just wanted him to know that he had a friend, even if it was fuck all I could do. And then I think that there isn't a God, you know? He looked up at me and there was something in his eyes that clutched at my heart. A painful, hopeless emptiness. A void that no boy should have ever had within him. I've always thought that there must be something up there, out there, wherever, something looking down on us, something with some kind of power over us. But maybe it isn't good, you know? How can it be when you think of all the shit that goes on? Maybe it gets off on being mean, on being vicious, or maybe it just doesn't care. Would that be worst of all, if it didn't care either way? I could have spoken. Maybe I did, I don't remember doing, but anything I said would have been a token response. I hadn't been raised in an overly religious household, and I didn't really believe in anything myself. At best, I thought life was just some wonderful accident with no design to it at all, no real purpose. We just existed, and the sensible people made the most of it, the rest just sat around questioning it. I feel differently now, but it's still not something I care to dwell upon. But how clearly I still remember Dave sitting there in that gathering darkness beneath the twisted old trees, his eyes gleaming with hatred and hurt, his hands clutching that unnatural and inexplicable stick figure. And how clearly I remember his words. I want him gone. I didn't see Dave again for some time. He should have been in school the next day, and he wasn't, nor the day after that. I can't remember how many days he was gone, only that when I saw him again, the black eye hadn't quite faded, and the busted lip hadn't quite gone down. I'm sure at some point a teacher must have took him aside and spoke to him, but I'm also sure this had probably happened before and it never led anywhere. I know there was a lot of laughter from the other kids about it, and not all of them had the decency to do it behind his back. We went to the woods after school and he didn't talk about it or anything much. I felt the weight of all the unspoken words. It made me nervous, made me uncomfortable. Something was twisting in my gut. I didn't know what, if anything, I could say or do to help. That's the thing about other people's problems. Sometimes all we can do is stand on the sidelines and watch them battle through, however much we care. The stick figures were there again, or still there. They may have been the same ones, they may have been different ones, I don't know, and maybe it doesn't matter. Dave picked one up, stared at it. He sat down and wouldn't stop looking at the fucking thing all the time we were there. He said, and I remember this vividly, "It's my father." I don't know what he meant by that. It looked the same as any of the other damn things we'd seen. Or maybe it was a little... No. It's no good. I saw nothing. We left when darkness set in, though beneath those trees it seemed to close in too thick and too fast. I was glad to get out, and even more glad when we reached the streets again and marched between the lights from pool to pool of a sickly glare. Lights came on in the houses, lives going on behind closed curtains. Dave still carried that fucking stick figure with him, and he was breaking it up as we went along, twisting off small parts of it and dropping them to the pavement, almost as though he was leaving a trail all the way to his door. That thought occurred to me then, and I didn't like it. I like it even less now. I didn't sleep too well that night. Something was coming for me out of the woods. At the very least, in my dreams it was. I heard branches creaking and scraping at the glass, though there were no trees close enough to my parents' house for that to be anything but a dream, and for years afterwards I was thankful for that. I saw moonlight, or some kind of light, shining through twisted branches. I saw them weaving around themselves to form some kind of shape, but knew that if I lived to see its final form, then it would be the last thing I did see before it came for me. I struggled through the next day at school as if I were wading through a sludgy pond. Perhaps it was my remoteness that made Dave wait until lunchtime to pull me aside in the schoolyard, behind a low wall that mostly sheltered us from the running, screaming chaos of playtime, though not from the sight and stink of the bins that contained most of the scrapings from a canteen. "Look at this," he urged, and opened his school bag and pulled out one of the stick figures. Instantly, I recoiled, both mentally and physically. "What are you doing with that?" I asked. "Did you go back there on your own?" "I found it on my doorstep this morning. It's the same one." I didn't want to ask what he meant by that, and nor did I have to. I was trying to keep my mind empty, especially of the image of something coming out of the woods and following the trail he, had left for it the previous evening. "It can't be the same one," I told him, or myself, but my voice was so flat and so quiet that it carried even less conviction than I felt, which was, admittedly, next to none. "Why didn't it come for him?" Dave hissed and stuffed the figure back into his bag. This time, I did need some clarification. "What do you mean?" "My fucking dad! The bastard! Why didn't whatever it was come for him? Why did it just leave this on the doorstep? I thought..." He'd worked himself up, and then he suddenly stopped, almost as though embarrassed by the tears that were about to spill. He looked away, knuckled at his eyes, barked something that might have been a laugh. "Can you stay at mine tonight?" he asked. I was torn, believe me. I still felt as though there was more I should be doing to help my friend, and yet I really didn't want to be around his father. My wordless response must have told him this, because he then added, "Don't worry, he won't do anything if you're around." "Okay," I mumbled, and the relief on his face must have equalled the anxiety I felt. The rest of the day flew by as though time itself was eager to be over and done with whatever the night had in store. Dave's father would be working until 7, he told me, and so he tagged along as I went home to square it with my own parents. I wasn't at all sure what Dave's father did as a job, and it never felt the right moment to express an interest in the man. My mother tried pressing some food on us, but Dave reassured her we'd eat at his house. He seemed eager to be away, though I'm pretty sure that was just so his father couldn't get home before he did. We walked, and the colour drained out of the sky. Trees groped towards us from the roadside. Their branches shook as though something unseen was pacing us through them. I'd never stayed at Dave's house before, and right now seemed the worst of all possible times to do so. But if it meant his father would lay off him for a night, then surely I was being brave on his behalf. Surely it meant I was protecting him. But Dave seemed preoccupied, worried instead of reassured. I tried talking to him and would pull him out of a reverie into which he would soon sink again. His eyes darted to the shadows that gathered around us as the streetlights flickered on. Once or twice, I even caught him looking back over his shoulder. It was dark by the time we reached his house. Above us, a sky pressed down that would have been black had the streetlights not lent it the orange taint. Dave's house was in the middle of a warren of streets, rough, run-down houses with yards that seemed to be competing with one another for which could look most unloved. Some were home to cars that looked as though they hadn't been roadworthy for longer than I'd been alive. Some were scattered with broken fragments of children's play equipment. Some were paved over and decorated with dog shit. The occasional gang of teenagers or younger grouped on street corners, in bus shelters with broken panes of glass, or beneath streetlights. They let us pass with nothing more than surly glances and the occasional comment designed to see if we wanted to fight. We let ourselves in through a gate that dragged across the path, and when Dave opened the front door, the house breathed a stale, unwashed smell at us. I could tell from the set of his face as we stepped inside that he was embarrassed by the house and wouldn't normally have chosen to invite me in. Still, here we were, and he reached past me to lock the door and shut us inside with whatever the night had in store for us. His father wasn't due home for another hour, and probably not even then. We spent the time in his bedroom, a small rectangle barely bigger than a single bed, listening to music on a cheap cassette player. The music was quiet, at a level obviously learned from his father's previous objection to hearing it from outside the room. After a while, he asked me if I was hungry, and I really wasn't, but I said yes, just for something to break the tension, to alleviate the feeling that we were merely waiting for something unavoidable and unpleasant. Sometime later, the slamming of a door announced his father's homecoming. Dave jumped up from the bed, and I wondered if he was wary of his father bursting in and finding us sitting on it together. But he turned the music even lower and dashed out of the door, saying, "I'd better just tell him you're here." I couldn't help feeling that he would use my presence as a form of protection for himself that night, but that I'd expected as much all along. I heard voices in the hallway downstairs. Dave's was recognisable, though so quiet that I couldn't make out the words, and his father's voice was low and ugly, that of a brute, though probably one under enforced good behaviour when he realised that an outside presence was listening. The voices seemed to burrow beneath the bed as the two went into the kitchen, and my heart pounded until Dave returned safely to the bedroom. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked gruffly, not wanting to become involved in any trouble, but wanting to sound brave. Dave nodded. "He won't try anything when you're here. I'll be safe for one night at least." Nevertheless, we kept things quiet. We both had a little homework to do and threw ourselves into the task with a lot more focus and energy than we would normally muster. That evening felt like it lasted forever. At one point, Dave's father yelled out for him and Dave raced downstairs. He came back sometime later and pulled a face but said nothing. I think he'd seen that his father started drinking and was worried what trouble he might cause. As it was, aside from the occasional roar from downstairs, he didn't do anything. That wasn't the worst part of the night. That wasn't what we truly had to be afraid of. At some point, his father stomped upstairs. We heard him pissing all over the bathroom and falling into the door and punching it. We heard him swearing at his own feet as they did their best to trip him up and send him tumbling down the stairs. We heard him make his way across the small landing and slam his bedroom door shut, collapse onto the bed and almost immediately begin snoring. By this time, we'd long since turned off the music and the light and were pretending to be asleep ourselves. I'd made up a bed on the narrow strip of floor. My held breath finally escaped from me, and I heard Dave gasping with similar relief. Perhaps it was that relief which let us sleep. For the next thing I knew, something else had caused my eyes to open, and I saw shadows crawling across the patch of light cast through the thin curtains by the streetlights outside. The room was sketched in a murky grey-orange, but most of it was still black. Black so dense that it seemed to swarm. Perhaps that wasn't entirely an illusion, though, for I could hear something moving within the room. It hardly seemed possible for the noise to be in here with us, for the only thing I could relate it to was the creaking of tree branches in the wind, and indeed that's what the shadows in the patch of light brought to mind. But when I looked up at the window, there was no tree outside, and the sounds were too close and somehow too furtive. It was almost the noise of an animal scurrying about in the dark, something trying to stay hidden. "Dave!" I hissed, and the noises stopped, and then resumed with fresh vigour. I called his name again and slapped a hand around on top of the bed, soon colliding with his body and waking him with a start. "What is it?" he mumbled blearily, and then asked again, but this time the question wasn't directed at me. "There's something in here," I whispered, and as the creaking came closer, I saw what it was. Something was materializing in the faint patch of light. I could make out a crouched figure, larger than myself but smaller than a grown man. It seemed to be thrashing as though in pain, and every movement brought the sound of creaking trees, of branches bending just before they broke. Its limbs, which may have been too many and were certainly too long, looked that way too. I could see a head, lowered though it was, and it was long and viciously curved, like a huge beak. It was so faint right at that moment that I had to blink repeatedly to clear my eyes and get a grasp on it, but it was becoming more and more solid the longer I watched, and I knew what had brought it. "The stick figure," I said, and I was no longer primarily concerned with staying quiet. "Where is it?" "My bag," he said, "the corner," and I remembered seeing it there earlier. The trouble was, I'd have to get past whatever was taking shape in order to reach it. With the unthinking bravery or stupidity of youth, I threw myself towards the corner, and the apparition raised its abominable head as I passed. I say passed, but I'm fairly certain I must have gone through the fucking thing because there was so little room. I felt a sensation like wet leaves dragging over my skin. I could smell earth and vegetation, though of a rotten and unpleasant kind. Then my hands closed around that stick figure, and I turned to throw it out the window. I couldn't. The thing was there, and it was almost solid, and it was reaching towards me with branches that were either tentacles or its arms. "Throw it to me, now!" Dave yelled, and I turned and did just that. He was standing by the bedroom door, and I managed to throw the figure easily to him before the apparition realised what I was doing. Could it realise? Was I crediting it with an intelligence beyond the most basic? Dave grabbed the stick figure and darted out of the room, and I had an awful heart-sinking moment where I thought he'd left me alone to meet whatever fate the fucking thing had in store for me, before I realised it was gone. Just like that. Apart from myself, the room was empty. I didn't have long to wonder about it. I heard Dave opening the door to his father's room, and an instant later he slammed it shut again. Some part of me must have instantly realised what he was doing, for even as he was calling out to me, I was rushing out to him. He had hold of a door handle, and he was holding the door tight shut. "Help me," he asked, and I did just that. From beyond the door, I could hear his father muttering as the noise roused him from his sleep. Then I could hear that terrible creaking sound, and then a wordless bellow of rage and fear. I'm not sure what happened next, and I will never think about it too closely. I will admit to this. We held on to that door with all our strength. We held on to it while Dave's father tried to open it from the other side, while the sound of creaking wood grew louder and somehow less brittle, more organic. We held on to it all through the screaming and all through the other sounds, wet, tearing sounds. We held on to it until the struggle stopped, until the handle went slack, and until the screaming ended. Something burst against the other side of a door, like a bag of wet rubbish flung at a wall, and that's when we ran from the house. I don't remember what happened then. Not for quite some time. We were found wandering together, silent, pale and unresponsive, in the early hours of the morning. We were taken to hospital. We were questioned by the police. We were questioned by doctors. At some point, my parents took me home. I don't know where Dave went. My last sight of him, something was gone in his eyes, some spark, some part of his spirit, his humanity. I can't believe that ever returned. I never saw him again. I know that the police went to his house and found his father's bedroom a virtual bloodbath. From what I've heard, the man was pretty much torn apart, and they never actually found all of him. They presumed that the house had been broken into and that he'd been attacked. He had a criminal record, nothing major, but enough to make them stop looking very hard. Obviously, he'd just crossed the line with the wrong people. I don't know if they ever found a stick figure in that room. I'd guess not. I'd guess it, and whatever it was a beacon for, had long gone. And now, here we are, 20-something years later. It's amazing what you can push to the back of your mind when you want to, when you need to. I grew up, lost myself in the business of studying, meeting girls, learning how to become a human being. I moved in and out of relationships and jobs and homes and eventually settled on a good home and a good career, but still hadn't managed a good relationship. And today, I saw the story in the newspaper and everything started to come back to me. I don't live far from the town where I grew up, but since I left, I've never been back. My parents moved away after I did, and I never had any other reason to return. And I certainly never would have revisited the woods where Dave and I used to hang out until everything turned bad. But I rather think he might have gone back there, at least once, and quite recently. David Rowley has been convicted of killing his wife and her lover shortly after he discovered their affair. The murders have been described as extraordinarily brutal. Dave says he didn't do it. I believe him.